New York City has long been a battleground for some of the most brutal drug gang wars in American history. From the heroin-soaked streets of Harlem in the 1970s to the crack-fueled chaos of the 1980s and the prison-born rivalries of the 2000s, the city's underworld has been shaped by ruthless organizations like the Purple Gang, the Supreme Team, the Trinitarios, and warring factions of the Bloods and Crips. These conflicts left thousands dead, terrorized neighborhoods, and fueled a multi-billion-dollar drug trade that continues to evolve. This is the violent and unforgiving world of New York's deadliest gang wars. Number 4. Crips versus Bloods, the New York City Drug Gang Wars. In the early 1990s, New York City was no stranger to crime. It was a city built on the edge, gritty, ruthless, and soaked in the blood of generations of street wars. But when the infamous West Coast rivalry between the Crips and the Bloods began to spill into New York's 5 boroughs, the streets took on a new kind of chaos. This was more than just a turf war. It was a cultural takeover, a drug-fueled battle for dominance that would leave hundreds dead, entire neighborhoods paralyzed by fear, and a legacy of violence that still scars the city today. A wave of shootings in Brooklyn this weekend has police pointing to rising tensions between Crip and Blood gangs. Born in Los Angeles during the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Crips and Bloods were once seen as a strictly West Coast phenomenon. But by the 1990s, their reputation and their influence began crossing state lines. The epicenter of this East Coast expansion? Rikers Island. It was inside the walls of New York City's most notorious jail that the Bloods first took root, forming in direct response to violence and oppression by dominant Latin gangs like the Latin Kings and the Nietas. With black inmates frequently outnumbered and targeted, they united for survival. The Bloods quickly spread throughout the prison system, and soon to the streets. From Rikers, the Bloods began establishing sets in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Harlem, and Queens. Gangs like the Nine Tray Gangsters, G-Shine, and Sex Money Murder brought a new level of firepower and organization to New York's streets. But not far behind came the Crips, mostly through migration and prison transfers from the West Coast. They too began setting up their own cliques, such as the Rollin' 60s, Neighborhood Crips, and Grape Street affiliates. Soon, the Crips and Bloods were engaged in a full-blown turf war, fighting for dominance over drug corners, recruitment territories, and prison block control. Crack cocaine, heroin, and later marijuana and ecstasy became the currency of this underground empire. Blocks were carved up like chessboards. Shootings erupted in broad daylight, often over minor disputes that escalated into deadly retaliation cycles. Young men barely in their teens were pulled into the lifestyle. Recruited in schools, playgrounds, and public housing buildings, they were given guns, colors, and orders. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, New York City was bleeding. Caller: "They're shooting! They're shooting outside my building again! Please send someone, please!" The Crips and Bloods feud in New York wasn't just about West Coast colors. It evolved into a hyper-local, set versus set war, where even members of the same larger gang sometimes clashed. In Brooklyn, Brownsville, and East New York became war zones. In the Bronx, Soundview, Highbridge, and Edenwald saw daily violence. Harlem, long known for its own brand of organized crime, became a battleground for Crip and Blood expansion. The violence wasn't random, it was strategic, often linked to control over drug trafficking routes, extortion, and retaliation for prior hits. For law enforcement, the battles became a nightmare. Homicides went unsolved. Witnesses were too afraid to testify. Kids were dying, some as young as 13. In response, the NYPD created special gang units, while federal prosecutors began issuing RICO indictments to cripple the leadership of violent sets. Notably, in the 2000s, entire crews like the Nine Tray Bloods and Rollin' 60s Crips were hit with sweeping racketeering charges, putting dozens of gang members behind bars. But even with takedowns, the war didn't stop. it mutated. Inside prison, the war continued. On Rikers Island and in upstate facilities, violence between Crip and Blood inmates remained a daily occurrence. Outside, younger and more unpredictable members picked up the mantle, using social media to threaten rivals, flash weapons, and orchestrate real-world attacks. The line between reputation and death became razor-thin. Today, the violence continues, though quieter and more fragmented. The Crips and Bloods are still present in New York, just more decentralized, more tech-savvy, and in many ways, more dangerous. While older members age out or end up in federal prison, new ones are recruited every day, kids chasing fast money, respect, and revenge. The Crips versus Bloods war in New York was not a copycat conflict. It became its own beast. Fed by drugs, poverty, broken systems, and fractured homes, it left a trail of bodies and broken lives. It's a story not just of gang colors, but of a generation lost in the war for power, survival, and identity. This was the story of the Crips and Bloods in New York City, a story written in blood across rooftops and alleyways, and one that still echoes through the streets today. Number 3. Dominican Trinitarios, Blood Feuds, and Bronx Battlefields. In the boroughs of New York City, behind the flashing lights and soaring skyscrapers, a brutal gang war has raged for decades, largely hidden from the public eye. This is the story of the Dominican Trinitarios, a feared and deeply organized gang born inside prison walls, and of their long, bloody war with the Bloods, Crips, and other rival crews that has turned neighborhoods like the Bronx, Harlem, and Washington Heights into modern battlegrounds. From the 2000s to the present day, the Trinitarios' reign has become one of the most violent sagas in the city's criminal history. The Trinitarios gang was founded in the late 1990s in Rikers Island by Dominican inmates who formed for protection amid rising attacks from other prison gangs. With a motto of Dios, Patria y Libertad, God, Country, and Liberty, they began as a brotherhood but quickly evolved into a violent and hierarchical organization that extended far beyond prison walls. By the early 2000s, they had exploded onto the streets of the Bronx, Upper Manhattan, and later parts of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. Their specialty? Drug trafficking, weapons sales, extortion, and brutal violence. What separated the Trinitarios from many other gangs was their discipline and military-like structure. Orders came down from high-ranking members, often still incarcerated, and street soldiers carried them out with precision. Disloyalty, disrespect, or mistakes were met with swift and bloody retribution. But as their power grew, so did their enemies. By the mid-2000s, the Trinitarios were at open war with blood sets in the Bronx and Harlem. Many of these conflicts started in prison over control of housing units and spilled into the streets over turf, drug corners, and revenge. What followed was a relentless cycle of violence. Drive-by shootings, machete attacks, and street ambushes became increasingly common. The Trinitarios were known for their use of blades, long knives, and machetes to punish enemies in dramatic and often fatal displays. This tactic both terrified rival gangs and instilled fear into the local population. Entire blocks became no-go zones. Residents lived in fear. The police were often too late or too scared to intervene. A 15-year-old boy brutally attacked with machetes by suspected gang members. The violence reached national headlines on June 20, 2018, with the murder of Lisandro Jr. Guzman Feliz, a 15-year-old mistaken for a rival and hacked to death with machetes by Trinitarios members outside a Bronx bodega. The horrifying incident, caught on surveillance video, shocked the nation. Junior's cries for help, his desperate attempts to flee, and the gang's cold-blooded savagery ignited protests and public outrage. For many, it was the first time they had seen the gang war in such raw, undeniable form. The murder of Junior became a turning point. Multiple Trinitarios members were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. Authorities vowed to dismantle the gang. Raids, indictments, and RICO charges followed. But while law enforcement celebrated arrests, the underlying war continued. The Trinitarios didn't just fight the Bloods, they've also clashed with Crips, Latin Kings, Nietas, and even splinter factions within their own ranks. Internal greenlights have led to civil wars between different Trinitario sets, adding even more bodies to an already blood-soaked story. In response, NYPD gang task forces, the DEA and FBI have conducted dozens of takedowns since 2010, charging members with everything from murder and racketeering to drug and gun trafficking. But despite these efforts, the Trinitarios remain a dominant force, recruiting younger and younger members through schools, social media, and street intimidation. These are not isolated skirmishes. These are long-term turf wars with deep cultural, economic, and territorial roots. Today, the war still simmers beneath the surface. In the Bronx, tensions continue between the Trinitarios and rival sets of the Bloods and Crips. Machete attacks, shootings, and social media threats occur with chilling regularity. The victims are often teenagers, sometimes innocent, always expendable. The Dominican Trinitarios have grown from a prison-born brotherhood into one of the most feared street gangs in the Northeast. Their war with the Bloods and others is far from over, and the communities they inhabit remain trapped in the crossfire. This is the story of the Trinitarios, a gang forged behind bars and baptized in blood. Their legacy is one of discipline, violence, and fear. Their war with the Bloods and other gangs has shaped the criminal landscape of New York for over 2 decades and shows no signs of slowing down. Number 2. Supreme Team, the Queens Drug Empire, and the War that Followed. In the heart of South Jamaica, Queens, during the crack epidemic of the 1980s, a ruthless drug empire rose from the ashes of poverty and institutional neglect. This was not just a street gang, it was a well-organized, highly disciplined drug syndicate that operated like a corporation, and it was led by a man who would become a legend in the criminal underworld. His name was Kenneth Supreme McGriff, and the organization he built would come to be known as the Supreme Team. The streets of Queens were already volatile, but when crack cocaine flooded into New York City, the landscape changed forever. By 1985, Supreme and his inner circle had turned housing projects like Baisley Park into fortresses of fear and wealth. The Supreme Team was pulling in an estimated $200,000 a day in drug revenue. They wore silk suits, drove luxury cars, and partied in Manhattan nightclubs with celebrities and rappers. But behind the glitz was a reign of terror. Anyone who crossed the Supreme Team or interfered with their business was marked for death. Competitors were executed in broad daylight. Suspected informants were tortured or disappeared without a trace. At the heart of this brutality was Gerald Prince Miller, Supreme's nephew and the gang's top enforcer. Prince didn't just eliminate threats, he made examples of them. Killings were precise, calculated, and often public. His personal body count was rumored to be in the dozens, and as the bloodshed mounted, so did the attention of law enforcement. But the NYPD was not prepared to deal with the Supreme Team's level of organization or their reach. Some officers were paid off. Others were simply afraid. Supreme and his crew operated with impunity, protected not just by guns, but by layers of loyalty and silence. The crack cocaine they sold turned neighborhoods into war zones. Children were caught in the crossfire. Addicts flooded emergency rooms. And still, the Supreme Team continued to grow, branching into robbery, extortion, and even arms trafficking. But even empires built on fear and money have enemies. Rival drug dealers began pushing into the Supreme Team's territory. Turf wars erupted across South Jamaica. One by one, small-time crews were wiped out. Some were driven out of Queens. Others were gunned down in their homes, on their blocks, even in front of family. The violence spilled over into the streets like never before. Drive-bys, ambushes, and execution-style killings became the norm. And through it all, the community lived in terror, too afraid to speak out, too scarred to resist. Eventually, the bloodshed became too loud to ignore. The FBI launched an all-out assault on the Supreme Team. Undercover agents infiltrated their ranks. Wiretaps captured coded conversations. Informants, some of them tortured or coerced, began to talk. In 1987, the feds moved in. Raids across Queens netted weapons, drugs, and documents. Supreme was arrested and charged with running a continuing criminal enterprise. Prince was also arrested, facing a long list of murder charges. The fall of the Supreme Team marked the end of one of New York's most brutal drug dynasties, but its legacy never truly disappeared. Supreme would later be linked to rap mogul Irv Gotti and Murder, Inc. records. In the early 2000s, he would once again be indicted, this time on conspiracy charges linked to more murders and drug trafficking. Prince, meanwhile, was sentenced to multiple life terms in federal prison. He remains incarcerated to this day. The Supreme Team left a permanent scar on New York City. They were not just drug dealers, they were architects of chaos, men who turned crack cocaine into currency, fear into power, and neighborhoods into war zones. Their story is a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition meets violence, and when the line between hustler and killer disappears in the smoke of the street. This was the story of the Supreme Team, a story of power, profit, and the price of blood. Number 1. The Purple Gang, H. Horror, and the Bronx Drug Wars. In the shadows of New York's concrete jungle during the dying days of the 1970s and the rise of the 1980s, a new breed of criminal emerged. Cold, calculating, and ferociously violent, they were not your typical street gang. They were enforcers, assassins, and traffickers all rolled into one. They were known as the Purple Gang, and their reign marked one of the most gruesome and terrifying chapters in New York City's drug wars. The Purple Gang was born from the streets of the South Bronx and Harlem, and unlike their Detroit namesakes from the 1920s, this crew had no nostalgic charm. They were a hybrid criminal enterprise, young, ruthless Puerto Rican and African American men, many of them trained in prison and released back onto the streets with deadly intent. Operating during the peak of New York's heroin epidemic, they weren't just dealers. They were enforcers for the Italian mafia, particularly the Genovese and Lucchese crime families, who had long controlled the city's heroin pipeline through the French Connection. But the mob needed muscle. They needed men who could enforce debt, silence witnesses, and eliminate rivals. The Purple Gang became their solution. They specialized in contract killings, intimidation, and drug distribution, often working as middlemen between the mafia and street-level dealers. But soon, their ambition outgrew their role. They began setting up their own heroin operations, cutting into mafia profits, and competing against other established Black and Latino drug crews. It wasn't long before turf wars erupted across Harlem and the South Bronx. And when the Purple Gang struck, the violence was apocalyptic. Bodies were discovered dismembered in plastic bags and stuffed into garbage cans. Some were burned beyond recognition. Others were found with their tongues cut out, a message to would-be informants. The Purple Gang was also credited with introducing new levels of savagery into the street-level drug game. Torture, beheadings, dismemberments, methods once reserved for mafia vendettas, were now carried out by kids from the projects, some barely old enough to drink. They didn't just kill, they made examples. Much of the gang's notoriety came from its connections to Rikers Island and Attica, where many of its core members were originally recruited or radicalized. The gang had a strict internal structure, often more disciplined than law enforcement realized. Orders were passed through coded letters and contraband cell phones. As the gang grew, so did their influence in the heroin trade. At their peak, they were believed to control or supply up to 40% of the heroin flowing through Harlem, an empire worth millions. But with power came enemies. The Purple Gang was locked in bloody conflict with rival drug crews, most notably factions led by Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas, who had once reigned as kings of Harlem. The competition for control of distribution corners and stash houses sparked open warfare. Gun battles erupted outside nightclubs, apartment buildings, and even playgrounds. Innocent civilians, children, and bystanders were frequently caught in the crossfire. Fear gripped the neighborhoods. Snitching meant certain death. And even the mafia began to grow uneasy at the monster they had helped create. By the early 1980s, law enforcement could no longer ignore the Purple Gang's bloody footprint. The FBI, DEA, and NYPD launched Operation Purple Rain, a multi-agency task force targeting the gang's leadership. Undercover agents infiltrated the drug network. Wiretaps recorded hours of cryptic conversations. Stashes of heroin, weapons, and cash were seized in coordinated raids across the Bronx and Harlem. One by one, leaders of the Purple Gang were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to long prison terms. But by then, the damage had been done. The Purple Gang's reign may have lasted only a few years, but its legacy was cemented in blood. They blurred the lines between organized crime and street-level terror. They brought mafia-level violence to public housing corridors, and they helped accelerate the disintegration of communities already crumbling under the weight of heroin, poverty, and neglect. To this day, their name remains whispered in the streets of New York, a symbol of unrelenting violence, fear, and the darkest era of the drug wars. This was the story of the Purple Gang, a ghost from the heroin-soaked past of New York City. A reminder of how ambition, greed, and violence can turn men into monsters and neighborhoods into killing fields.